So onto method 2, which is called MIDI, or sometimes people call it sequencing. Now this is another method which has a lot of detail written into it, but it's not really intended for reading it. It's more intended for controlling software instruments and synthesizers and things like that. Now there's some free software which you can play around with this. If you have a Mac or an iPad, then GarageBand is free, I believe. This has a sequencer in it, and it's great. It's got loads of different sounds and stuff. If you have a Windows computer, there's some software called LMMS. You can just find that on Google. Again, it's free and it's got everything you need to start sequencing, and I think it has some instruments built in and stuff. So these programs are called DAWs, or Digital Audio Workstations, and usually they don't just do MIDI. You can do audio recording, you can do mixing, you can do all kinds of stuff in them. But don't worry too much for now, we're just talking about the MIDI sequencing side of it. So there's kind of 2 or 3 really ways of writing with MIDI. So either you can record it straight in by playing on a MIDI keyboard, and that's really, really useful because without thinking about it too much, you can just play it, the computer records it, but it's not recording the sound, it's just recording information about basically which notes you hit when and for how long. And then it comes up on this editor, which I'll talk about in a second, and you can then tweak it as much as you want, change things, correct any mistakes, or just, you decide you wanted to actually change the melody a little bit, so you can do that easily. You can just click a note and move it. You could also just draw it in from scratch using your mouse and keyboards. On the same editor, you just click where you want a note and decide how long it wants to be and all that sort of thing. The third way is using pre-existing MIDI loops. Now this is kind of confusing because this is a different thing to audio loops, which we'll talk about later, but kind of works in a similar way. So GarageBand already has loads of loops built in, I think, and if you drag in a loop, you can then look at it in the MIDI editor and change it around a bit. So say you find like a cool bass line or something as a loop, you can then say, actually it's kind of cool, but that particular note doesn't quite work with my song, or it's a nice idea but actually I want it to have just a different set of notes, or change the rhythm a bit, and you can make it your own from a starting point that's kind of already given to you, which is really useful. So those are the 3 ways of kind of inputting MIDI. So now I'll talk a little bit about how to edit it. So on your screen you'll see what's called piano roll. Now it's basically a big grid. So you've got spaces going up like that for each one is a note. Now it's not quite the same as notation in that each note is a semitone. So it's as if you're going up a piano but with all the notes, not just the white ones. Like every single note is a semitone. So usually you wouldn't use every single one of these notes together. You'd kind of pick a scale and use that. But you can just use your ears because you can just drag the notes around, and if it sounds good, it is good. And if it doesn't, you can just keep moving it. So it's not as complicated as it might appear at first. So that's the pitch. Again, higher pitch, higher on the screen. No clefs to worry about because you can just scroll. So the rhythm is basically it's just each note will appear as a little kind of rectangle sitting on whichever pitch line you've put it on, and then you can just change the length of it on the screen. You can change the position of it, and there'll be a little grid in the background so you can kind of line it up with the beats in the bar. But you don't have to worry so much about what all the notes are called. You don't have to know if it's a quarter note or a 16th note or whatever, because you just say, oh, I want faster notes, so I'll just make them shorter and put lots of them in there. So in some ways it's easier than notation if you don't have a lot of music theory already. And it's also quite flexible because you can use it to control all kinds of synthesizers and software instruments and sample libraries, and you can make pretty much any sound you can imagine and control it with MIDI. So where we had dynamics in notation, in MIDI it's got a different name. It's known as velocity. And usually that's shown as what colour the note is. It's sort of, as it gets louder, it blends from, usually it's like a sort of light green for really quiet, and then it goes through to red for really loud. And it usually has a value between 0 and 127. So you can either play it in, you can draw it in, you can use loops and edit them, you can use it to control pretty much any sound you want, and you can make all kinds of really cool things with it. And the nice thing about MIDI is that it's not like you're writing something out for musicians to then read and play, you're just making the computer play it. So as you're composing it, you're also you get to hear exactly what it's sounding like as you go, and you can sort of turn it straight into the final product. If you do want live musicians to play something, a lot of computer generated instruments don't sound that great, things like string instruments, then most programs can automatically turn MIDI into standard notation. Some of them work better than others with that, but it can be useful anyway. So the third method that I'm going to talk about is looping and sampling. Now this is really common in rap and hip-hop based genres, and it can be really interesting to kind of experiment with as well, and it's just a very different approach to composing. Essentially what it is taking a tiny little snippet. It could be one note, or it could be a couple of bars, 4 bars, 8 bars or something from an existing recording, say a song you heard on the radio, and then chopping it up in software and manipulating it, applying sound effects, changing the pitch, changing the speed, doing all kinds of things to it, and combining it often with live instruments or with MIDI instruments or with more loops, and kind of using little chunks of other music to create something completely new. Now this opens up a whole load of different options, and there's some amazing music written in this way, and it just makes you think a bit differently. So rather than coming up with every single little melodic thing yourself, coming up with every drum beat yourself, you might just be kind of walking around and hear a song on the radio, and maybe just one little drum beat in the bridge catches your attention, and you don't really care about the whole song. You just want this like 2 little bars of drums because they play something cool. So you might find that recording, put it into your DAW, your digital audio workstation, find the 2 bars you want, chop them out, delete everything else, and then you've got your little 2 bars of drums, and then you can just repeat them. Just copy and paste them. You might change the speed of them, change the pitch of them, apply some crazy effects, do whatever you want. And then suddenly you can add a new bass line, add a new melody, you could rap over the top of it, you could program some more MIDI instruments like we were talking about earlier, and you've got a whole new piece of music. Just out of one little snippet that you heard that caught your attention. So it's a nice way of kind of finding inspiration from other music and running with that to create something new. The other key thing about this is a little bit like I was talking about with MIDI, but even more so, you're not writing something down to then be played in the future. You're actually creating the finished product as you go. So whatever you do to the sound in the program, that's what it's going to sound like. So that's really cool. You can kind of, instead of thinking so much about notes and melodies, you can use sound more. So, for example, instead of worrying so much about what the chords are doing, maybe the whole frequency range of your music is kind of starts off sounding really dark and sort of muddy, and then gradually gets brighter towards the chorus, and then you've used texture rather than any sort of melodic elements to make your composition more interesting. So the fourth method I'm going to talk about is lead sheets or lyric sheets or chord sheets, or they're all kind of the same thing. And basically this is mostly for people who write on their own instrument. So there isn't actually much detail written down at all. There's a lot left open to interpretation by whoever's going to play it. Now, it might be that they've kind of learnt the song already by ear and they're just using the lead sheet as a kind of prompt sheet, really, just to remember all the extra information they've got in their head. Or it might be in a genre like jazz, where there's a lot of improvisation, that you only actually want to give people something quite simple, so that they can use that as a basis to all improvise their own accompaniments and their own solos and stuff around that basic lead sheet. So basically what it would be, in instrumental music you would have the main sort of melody written out as standard notation, and then over the top you'd have little chord symbols. So instead of writing the whole chord out as notes, you'd just have, for example, A minor, and whoever's reading those chords knows how to play an A minor on their instrument, probably a lot of different ways of playing an A minor on their instrument which they could choose between. But what it doesn't tell them is really anything about the rhythm, or anything about the dynamics, or what register of their instrument to play it in, or the voicing of the chord, or anything like that. So it, like I said, it just leaves a lot of freedom for the performer to read this and kind of do their own version of it, basically. It's also just quick and easy to write down. If you've got like 40 songs in a concert, you can just have one little sheet for each song, rather than having pages and pages and pages with every note written out. So that's an instrumental lead sheet. A lyric sheet often doesn't even have the melody notated out. It'll just have the lyrics and little chord symbols above the lyrics where they sort of match up so that you're changing chords at the right time. Now this can be really, really useful if you're writing. Say you're part of a band and you've come up with a song, and you've got some lyrics and a bit of a melody, and you're kind of strumming chords on a guitar, and so you write down a little lead sheet. You don't have to spend ages putting in every single note. You just kind of write your lyrics, write your chords, and then you can take it to a rehearsal with your band and you can all work together to come up with the details of the arrangement. So sometimes you might combine it with notation and MIDI and other things like that, but it's just a really good starting point to kind of get something down without having to spend ages on all the details and sort of get distracted by that. So in summary, there are a lot of different ways you can approach this, a lot of ways of writing things, a lot of ways of actually making the finished product. But it's really important to get at least a basic grasp of all of these different methods. Partly because, you know, it might help you get out of a sort of writer's block. It just makes you think a little bit differently, doing things in different ways. But also, it means it's much easier to work with other musicians from slightly different backgrounds. So say you're a rapper, like I mentioned before, and you're working on this track and you just really want a live string quartet on this track. You think that would be perfect for it, and that's what you're hearing in your head. Most string players, violinists and cellists and people, not all of them, but most of them will want to read notation. They won't usually just kind of read lead sheets or play things by ear. Obviously this is a general rule, but it's much better if you're able to just write something out for them to play. You know they're going to play exactly what you intend, and you can just work with people much more easily. Vice versa, if you're like a flute player and you're a bit bored of just playing the classical pieces your teacher gave you, you hear like a cool bass line in a song on the radio, you can just make your own little loop out of it. Do whatever you want, slow it down, change the key, add some other instruments, and suddenly you've got a whole new thing to improvise over or write your own music. And it's a completely different approach that would lead you down completely different musical avenues than if you'd sat down with what you're used to and notated something note by note. So all of these methods are really valuable. Have a look at all of them, and there's free software available so that you can try things out and get to grips with them. Loads of other resources online as well to teach you how they all work and how the software all works and everything. So the free software, just to recap, MuseScore 3, MUSESCORE. That's for notation. LMMS is a sequencer for MIDI, and you can also use that to, I think you can do basic loops and sampling and stuff on that as well. If you've got a Mac or an iPad or something like that, GarageBand is great, that'll do all that stuff. If you're on Windows and LMMS doesn't work for you for some reason, Audacity is another free one, and that's really, really good for all the sampling and manipulation and stuff like that. But the most important thing you can take away from this is the voice memo thing I mentioned. Every time you have a tiny little idea, just record it. Doesn't matter if you can sing, this isn't for anyone else to listen to, this is just for your own reference. So you might be just tapping a little rhythm on your knee while you're sat on the bus. Just record it, a little 3-second clip. And getting into this habit just makes writing music so much easier. You never have that feeling again where you sit down to compose and think, I've got nothing, where do I even start? Because you just look through your voice memos, pick one, and then experiment with it, develop it, try different things with it. And before you know it, you've written a whole piece.